Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into relationships today. Well, more specifically, we're going to explore some of those subtle signs that your husband might be exhibiting some narcissistic traits. Our guide for this deep dive is clinical psychologist Dr. Todd Grande and his YouTube video, 10 Signs of a Husband with Narcissistic Traits.
Dr. Grande really lays out some fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes unsettling patterns of behavior that can show up in long-term relationships.
And just to be super clear up front, we are not trying to play an armchair psychologist here. This isn't about diagnosing anyone. We're approaching this from a place of curiosity, using Dr. Grande's expertise to understand some of the psychological dynamics that can play out in marriages.
Exactly. Think of it like a roadmap, not a rule book. It's about recognizing patterns and understanding why certain behaviors might be so damaging in the long run.
Okay, so before we jump into those 10 signs, let's start with the basics. What are we even talking about when we say narcissism?
Well, Dr. Grande highlights a few key characteristics: an inflated sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration, and a deep-seated sense of entitlement.
So I'm familiar. I think, when we think of narcissist, we often picture that stereotypical loud, arrogant personality. But Dr. Grande actually talks about two main types of narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable.
Right, and what's fascinating is that most people actually exhibit a blend of both.
Okay.
Grandiose narcissism is more overt, the classic look at me, I'm amazing type. But vulnerable narcissism can be much more subtle, often masked by insecurity and hypersensitivity.
So it's not always about being flashy and attention grabbing. It can be about manipulation and control in a much quieter way.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the bigger picture, the patterns of behavior over time, rather than just isolated incidents.
Got it. Okay, so let's get into those patterns. Dr. Grande's first sign is infidelity and fantasy. He talks about how a narcissistic husband often views his wife as never good enough, which can lead to fantasies about the ideal partner.
And this is where that sense of entitlement really comes into play. Dr. Grande points out that a narcissistic husband might feel like he has a right to seek out additional relationships without any regard for his wife's feelings or the sanctity of their vows.
That's heartbreaking, honestly. It's like he's rewriting the rules of the relationship to suit his own needs.
And it can be incredibly damaging because it creates this fundamental lack of trust and security in the marriage.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, sign number 2 is controlling appearance. This is where the husband becomes fixated on his wife's looks, often putting intense pressure on her weight or how she dresses.
Dr. Grande even mentions how a narcissistic husband might be offended if his wife suggests they both work on their appearance.
Oh, wow.
It really highlights that one-sidedness, that lack of reciprocity in the relationship.
It's almost like he sees his wife as an extension of himself, like a possession he needs to control and perfect.
And that control can extend beyond physical appearance. The third sign Dr. Grande discusses is ignoring emotional needs, which is something I think a lot of people can unfortunately relate to on some level.
Absolutely. It's that feeling of being completely shut down when you try to share your feelings with your partner, like you're talking to a brick wall.
Exactly. And Dr. Grande gives this really chilling example. Imagine a wife is upset about something, and instead of offering comfort or support, her husband criticizes her for being weak. That complete lack of empathy can be soul-crushing.
And, for couples with children, this dynamic can have even more devastating consequences. Dr. Grande's fourth sign, turning children against the wife, is a particularly tough one to grapple with.
It is. It's really disturbing because it involves manipulating children, pitting them against their own mother. Dr. Grande suggests that this behavior could be rooted in envy, that the narcissistic husband wants all the children's admiration for himself.
So it's almost like he's creating a competition within his own family, which is incredibly unhealthy.
And it's interesting. It ties back to that core need for control that we've been talking about. The narcissistic husband wants to control how everyone perceives him, including his own children.
This next sign, selfish activities, hits close to home for me. I think we've all experienced those moments where it feels like our partner's needs always come first. It's like their idea of quality time always revolves around their own interests.
Think about it. The wife might end up going to events alone, only accompanying her husband when it's something he wants to do. It creates a real imbalance in the relationship.
And then there's the flip side of that, which is sign number 6, jealousy of other men. This is where the husband becomes hypervigilant, scrutinizing his wife's interactions with any other man, looking for any hint of interest.
And Dr. Grande makes this chilling observation. These husbands might even demand their wives cut off contact with other men entirely, leading to isolation and even more control.
It's like he's trying to shrink her world, make her completely dependent on him.
Exactly. And, this jealousy can also extend to his wife's accomplishments. Dr. Grande's seventh sign, envy of the wife's success, is a really telling one.
It's not just about money. It's about anything that makes the wife shine, whether it's a promotion, a new hobby, or even just receiving compliments from others.
And I think it's important to explore the psychology behind this. Why would a narcissistic husband feel threatened by his wife's success?
That's a great question. What do you think is going on there?
Well, it goes back to that core need for admiration. The narcissistic husband sees the world as a zero-sum game. If his wife is successful, it somehow diminishes him. He needs to be the one in the spotlight.
So instead of celebrating her achievements, he might try to downplay them or even sabotage her efforts.
Exactly. And this can be particularly damaging because it undermines her confidence and sense of self-worth.
Okay, sign number 8 is a bit ironic. Poor listener, high expectations. Dr. Grande describes a husband who might appear to be listening, but his responses are all about him. He wants the wife's constant attention, but gives very little in return.
And here's the kicker. He often accuses the wife of not listening. It's classic projection. He's deflecting his own shortcomings onto her.
That's frustrating just to think about. It's like he's creating this double standard where he can tune out whenever he wants, but she's expected to be fully present and attentive at all times.
And that dynamic can be really exhausting for the wife.
Yeah.
Because it creates this constant feeling of being unheard and undervalued.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our list here. Sign number 9, downplaying domestic contributions, is one that I think might resonate with a lot of stay-at-home parents out there.
It's about the husband dismissing the value of raising children, managing the household, all that invisible labor that keeps a family functioning. He often sees his job as more important because it brings in money, completely ignoring the financial value of what his wife does at home.
It's like he's blind to the fact that if she wasn't doing all those things, he wouldn't be able to focus on his work. It's a huge blind spot. And it speaks to that inherent lack of respect for his wife's contributions.
And, that lack of respect can be even more insidious. In the final sign, Dr. Grande discusses the wife as a support system.
This one's heavy. It's about the narcissistic husband believing that his wife's sole purpose is to cater to his needs, including sexual demands.
And it raises a crucial question. What happens when those demands aren't met? Dr. Grande points out that the husband might threaten to seek satisfaction elsewhere, which is incredibly manipulative and damaging to the wife's self-esteem.
It's like he's reducing her to a collection of functions, rather than seeing her as a whole person, with her own needs and desires.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to recognize these patterns, to understand how they can erode the foundation of a healthy relationship.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we move on, I'd love to get your initial reactions. What stood out to you the most from these first 10 signs?
What's really striking to me is how interconnected these signs are. It's not about any one behavior in isolation. It's about a pattern of self-centeredness, lack of empathy, and a need for control. That can be really damaging in the long run.
Absolutely. And remember, we're not trying to diagnose anyone here. This is about raising awareness, helping people understand these dynamics so they can create healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
Right. And sometimes that means having tough conversations, setting boundaries, and seeking professional help if needed.
We'll dive deeper into those aspects in just a bit. Stay with us.
It's important to remember that these signs don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
Real relationships have layers of complexity, and we're talking about patterns of behavior, not a checklist.
And Dr. Grande is very clear about that in his video.
Yeah, just because you notice one or two of these traits doesn't mean you should jump to conclusions.
Right. It's the consistency, the persistent lack of empathy, and that ongoing need for control that can really point to a deeper issue.
And that's why I think conversations like this are so important.
Definitely.
For raising awareness, giving people a new lens through which they can view their own relationships. What I find fascinating is how these signs can manifest so differently depending on the individuals involved.
Oh, totally. Like, take controlling appearance, for example.
Yes.
Dr. Grande focuses mainly on weight. But couldn't this apply to other aspects of appearance too? Clothing choices, hairstyle, even how a wife wears her makeup.
Absolutely. And that's where things get even more complicated.
Right.
It's not always about overt demands, right? It can be subtle pressure, constant criticism, or just making the wife feel like she's never good enough.
Yeah.
as she is.
Yeah, it's almost like a slow chipping away at her self-esteem.
Exactly. And that brings us to, I think, a crucial point. Narcissistic behavior is often about power and control.
Making the other person feel small and dependent.
Precisely.
Okay, let's circle back to something you touched on earlier. The difference between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism.
Yes.
How might those types play out differently in a marriage?
Well, with grandiose narcissism, you might see a husband who's outwardly arrogant, demanding, always needing to be the center of attention.
The classic narcissist we see in movies.
Right. But with vulnerable narcissism, it's more subtle. The husband might be passive-aggressive, playing the victim, or constantly seeking reassurance and validation.
So instead of bragging, he might complain about how nobody appreciates him enough.
Exactly. And he might be more likely to use guilt and manipulation to get his needs met.
Which can be just as damaging, if not more so, in the long run.
Absolutely. It's all about control, ultimately.
Control.
And remember, these types aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
A husband can exhibit traits of both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism.
Making the dynamic even more challenging to navigate.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the husband's behavior, but what about the impact on the wife? Dr. Grande doesn't go into this too deeply in his video, but I think it's so important to acknowledge how these patterns can affect her emotional well-being.
Absolutely. Living with a narcissistic husband can be incredibly draining and isolating.
Yeah.
The constant criticism, lack of empathy, and emotional manipulation take a serious toll on her self-esteem and mental health.
It must feel like walking on eggshells all the time.
Exactly. Never knowing what might set him off.
Right. And that's why it's so crucial for wives in these situations to have a support system.
Yes. Friends, family, a therapist, anyone she can trust to listen and validate her experiences.
She needs that safe space to process what she's going through.
Because her reality might have become distorted over time.
You know, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the wife might start exhibiting certain behaviors as a coping mechanism.
Oh, that's a great point.
She might become withdrawn or overly agreeable.
Yes.
Or even start mirroring some of her husband's narcissistic traits as a way to protect herself.
It's a complex dynamic.
Yeah.
And it's not about blaming the wife, but understanding the ways in which she might adapt to survive in that environment.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. Dr. Grande doesn't really get into this in his video, but for a listener who's recognizing these patterns in her own marriage, what are some potential paths forward?
Well, the first step is acknowledging that there's a problem.
Which can be incredibly difficult.
Yes. Often, wives in these situations have been gaslighted and manipulated for so long that they start to doubt their own perceptions.
Yeah, it's like their sense of reality has been warped.
Exactly. That's why support from a therapist or a trusted friend is so important.
To help her regain that sense of self and see the situation more clearly.
Yes.
Okay, and then what? Can couples therapy even be effective when you're dealing with narcissism?
It can be challenging, but it's not impossible. The key is finding a therapist who specializes in narcissism and who understands the specific dynamics at play.
So the focus shouldn't just be on changing the husband's behavior.
Right. It's also about helping the wife set healthy boundaries and protect her own emotional well-being.
Creating a more balanced and respectful dynamic.
Exactly.
But what if the husband refuses to acknowledge the problem or refuses to go to therapy?
That's a really tough situation. Ultimately, the wife needs to prioritize her own well-being.
It might mean considering individual therapy to help her navigate the situation and make decisions that are best for her.
Yes. And sometimes that means separation or even divorce.
It's not an easy decision.
Of course not. But staying in a toxic relationship can be incredibly damaging to her mental and emotional health.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, and I think it's important to emphasize that recognizing these patterns is just the first step.
Right. It's not about labeling anyone or placing blame.
It's about understanding the dynamics at play and creating a more balanced and healthy relationship.
And sometimes that means seeking professional help or making difficult decisions to protect yourself.
This deep dive has certainly given our listener a lot to think about.
I hope so.
We'll wrap up with some final thoughts in just a moment. We've been exploring some pretty heavy stuff today.
Yeah.
These 10 signs of a narcissistic husband. As described by Dr. Todd Grande, paint a pretty stark picture.
They do.
But I always like to end our deep dives on a note of empowerment. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what we can do with this new understanding.
I like that, because knowledge truly is power.
It is.
And this whole conversation has really highlighted the importance of self-awareness.
Yes. both for individuals within a relationship and for those who might be observing these dynamics from the outside.
Right.
Let's say you're a friend and you've noticed some of these patterns in someone else's marriage. It can feel tricky to know what to do.
It can. You don't want to overstep. But you also care about your friend.
Exactly. So what would you advise in that situation?
I think the most important thing is to be a supportive listener. Create a safe space for your friend.
Right.
To share her experiences without judgment.
And avoid offering unsolicited advice.
Yes.
We're not therapists.
Right. But we can validate her feelings and encourage her to seek professional help if she needs it.
Sometimes just having someone believe you and acknowledge your pain can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's your biggest takeaway?
For me, it's Dr. Grande's emphasis on patterns. It's not about isolated incidents, but about consistent behaviors that create a toxic dynamic. And those patterns can be subtle, which is why it's so crucial to pay attention to how we feel in our relationships.
Do we feel respected, valued, safe to express our true selves?
Those are powerful questions to ask ourselves, and they apply to all relationships, not just marriages.
Absolutely. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, empathy, and a willingness to compromise.
So as you navigate the complex world of relationships, trust your gut, prioritize your well-being, and never settle for anything less than respect and genuine connection.
Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding these patterns can help you make informed choices and create healthier, happier relationships.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.